The marsh should have been breathing by dawn. Every morning of every season, when the night cooled the water's surface and the sun began pressing its warmth across the land, fog rose. Thin white veils drifted from the reeds, swirling above quiet pools, clinging to the legs of wading birds. Fog was the marsh's morning ritual, the sign that the wetlands were alive, that water still evaporated, that temperature gradients still existed. But today, as the stork stood on his long dark legs among the withering reeds, the fog refused to rise. He was an old male, marked by researchers with a small metal band, known as Eldrin, on their charts. His feathers, normally crisp and immaculate, hung slightly dull under a flat, heavy sky. The air felt warm, wrong, as if stuck between day and night. Dew should have been clinging to the reeds, to his legs, to the mud. Instead, the reeds crackled under the faint breeze of his movements, dry where they should be soaked. Eldrin tilted his head, listening. Silence. Not the peaceful kind, the suffocating kind. Frogs should have been croaking their dawn chorus. Insects should have been buzzing low. Dragonflies should have skimmed the still water. But the marsh was quiet, too quiet, as if waiting for something that should have happened hours ago. The stork lowered his beak toward the water. It sat dark and motionless, its surface almost oily, not from pollution, but from stillness. Normally, morning fog began to form the moment sunlight touched water colder than the air. Yet the sun had been up for nearly an hour, and the air remained trapped, warm and unmoving. He stepped forward, expecting soft mud to sink beneath his feet. Instead, the surface cracked around his toes, brittle like old clay. The waterline had receded even though no heat had yet burned it away. Eldrin stretched his long neck, tasting the air the way only a bird could, sensing moisture, the weight of humidity, the texture of the atmosphere. Something was missing, something vital. Moisture wasn't rising, the air wasn't lifting, the marsh wasn't exhaling. He took a few slow steps, scanning the reeds for movement. A carp's dorsal fin should have broken the surface at least once by now. Minnows should have rippled the shallows. But beneath him the water remained a smooth, perfect mirror, and the reeds around him looked brittle, aged before their time. Their tips had turned brown, curling inward as if they had lost their nightly replenishment of moisture. Eldrin froze suddenly, hearing distant mechanical hums. Humans. Across the marsh, on a raised wooden platform, 3 researchers stood beside meteorological instruments. Their boots cracked the dry mud as if stepping on old pottery. They wore thin jackets despite the warm morning, not for cold, but for the strange stillness that made the air feel unpleasant against skin. One bent over a humidity gauge. Still reading high humidity at ground level, she said, frowning. So where's the fog? Another scrolled on a tablet. Surface temperature is perfect for fog formation, but nothing is lifting. The third pointed at a small anemometer on a pole. Its blades were nearly still. No vertical air movement. Zero convection. The marsh air is trapped. Eldrin didn't understand their words, but he sensed their alarm. Sharp, clipped, unnatural in a place where scientists usually spoke calmly. He moved deeper into the reed bed. Usually insects burst out at his approach. Mosquitoes, midges, flies. Today they clung to stems, barely moving. Even the constant irritating drone of their wings was absent. The marsh was holding its breath. He opened his wings slightly, letting warm wind flow between his feathers. But the air didn't move as it should. It pressed against him like a stagnant cloud. Without vertical lift, no fog could form. Without fog, the marsh lost its protective blanket, the cycle that kept moisture in the soil, cooled water, and protected small creatures from the morning sun. He kept walking, passing a pool he knew well, a deep basin fed by groundwater. But now the waterline was lower, exposing roots of cattails that should never be bare. Their roots dried in the air, wrinkled and pale like exposed bone. A frog lay half submerged nearby, its skin dull. Eldrin approached and tapped the mud lightly. The frog twitched once, then settled again, too lethargic to flee. Frogs depended on humid morning fog to keep their skin moist. Without fog, dehydration crept in early. A dragonfly hovered above the pool, beating its wings weakly. Eldrin watched it circle in confusion. Dragonflies normally danced above fog layers, hunting insects rising with the vapour. But with no fog, no insects rose. The dragonfly made one more aimless circle before landing on a reed and folding its wings, already defeated. Eldrin continued forward until he reached a patch of cracked mud. He stomped gently, the cracks widened with a brittle snap. Last week, that spot had been under water. He lifted his head suddenly. A new sound. A low rumbling, like distant thunder. But it wasn't thunder. It was the human's boat approaching. The researchers slowed near the centre of the marsh, careful to avoid running aground on unexpectedly shallow water. One leaned over with a temperature probe. Surface temperature stable, still warm, doesn't match sunrise cooling curves. Another checked atmospheric readings. No radiative cooling last night either. Fog never formed because the ground didn't drop enough in temperature. The third scientist stared across the marsh with a troubled expression. If this continues, the wetland will start collapsing. We need nocturnal cooling to keep water cycles functioning. Eldrin watched them from the cattails, perfectly still except for the slow turn of his head. He had known many droughts. He had seen floods. He had witnessed storms strong enough to uproot trees. But this was different. This was not weather. This was absence. A cycle missing. An exhalation withheld. He stepped out onto a sandbar. The mud crumbled under his weight. Normally he hunted here at sunrise, when fog still clung to the marsh and fish moved near the edges, protected from birds of prey. Now the fish hid deep in the water, avoiding heat that should not exist so early. He looked at the sky. It was pale, almost white. No fog, not even haze. The air above the marsh looked hollow, as if scraped clean of moisture. Eldrin took a slow, measured breath. It felt dry. Dry in a way that frightened him. A heron croaked weakly across the marsh. Not a hunt call, not a greeting, but something like confusion. Eldrin saw it standing in a shallow pool, wings slightly open, mouth parted. Birds used gular fluttering to cool down. They never did it at dawn. But today, the marsh was already too warm. And without fog, the morning would heat quickly. He walked back toward the humans' platform, drawn by the strange tension in their movements. One of them knelt down, scooping cracked mud into a sample vial. Surface moisture is evaporating before it can rise. It's trapped at ground level. Fog can't form. The dew point is stuck. If the marsh can't release humidity upward, it's going to dry from the bottom up. Eldrin blinked slowly. Dry from the bottom up. He could already feel it. The mud drying beneath him, the reeds losing their sheen, the insects delaying their emergence, the quiet, the terrible quiet, of a place missing its breath. He spread his wings slightly again. No fog curled around them, no moisture kissed his feathers. The marsh was withering not from heat, not from drought, but from stillness, from a broken cycle that denied it the simple act of rising vapour. The stork stood tall, eyes scanning the horizon. He waited for the fog that defined his home. He waited for the marsh to breathe. He waited for the morning cycle to begin. But the reeds stayed dry, the water stayed flat, the air stayed trapped, and the fog, bound to the earth, refused to rise. Eldrin moved slowly across the drying mud, his long legs bending with practiced elegance, though each step felt more uncertain than the last. The marsh beneath him, a place that had always been soft, breathing, alive, now lay stiff and brittle. Cracks spidered across surfaces that should have been slick with morning dew. Every shift of his weight made the mud fracture in thin, sharp lines instead of yielding gently. The morning light strengthened, painting the reeds gold, but still no fog rose. Fog wasn't just a visual thing, it was life itself for this place, a mechanism that cooled the water, fed the plants, protected eggs, and signaled the marsh's daily awakening. Without fog, something foundational had broken. Eldrin waded into a deeper channel, expecting at least there to find the familiar coolness. But as his long toes touched the water, he felt warmth that should not exist at this hour. The temperature difference between night-cooled water and warming air was gone. Without that contrast, fog couldn't form. Without that contrast, the marsh couldn't breathe. Dragonflies clung to stems nearby. Their wings, usually shimmering in morning light, drooped limply. They did not fly. They vibrated their wings occasionally, testing the air, but the humidity remained pressed against the ground, too heavy to lift them. Their larvae, down in the mud, would suffer too. They required oxygenated water brought by continuous evaporation and mixing. But nothing was mixing. A frog surfaced beside Eldrin, eyes dull. It gulped air in slow, laboured movements. Its skin looked dry, puckered, lacking moisture even while half submerged. Frogs didn't dry out in marsh water, not unless the water lacked the cooling cycle and humidity balance that their bodies depended on. Eldrin watched as the frog attempted to dive deeper. It didn't move far. Warm water met it below. Its limbs twitched once, then it rose again, exhausted. The stork shook his head, feeling unease tightening his chest. He needed to search further. He moved toward a stand of cattails that usually thrived near the deepest pools. But even before he reached them, he saw signs of collapse. Their tall stalks had bent under the weight of their own dryness. Tips browned, leaves curled. Dehydration, not heat, not disease. The marsh wasn't feeding them. He leaned down, opening his beak slightly to taste the air again, but the air tasted stale. Moisture clung low, trapped, unable to rise or circulate. The scent of organic rot, normally subtle, lingered stronger, concentrated near the mud instead of dissipating upward. A rustle startled him. A heron emerged from the reeds, wings slightly lifted in discomfort. Eldrin recognized the bird, a resident heron who fished the same waters. But today the heron's feathers puffed unnaturally. He kept opening his mouth, throat fluttering, attempting to cool himself. Birds didn't pant at dawn unless something was terribly wrong. The heron stepped close, then paused, head tilting in confusion. Eldrin felt it too, the absence of the marsh's morning breath. No rising cool air currents, no swirling vapour, just trapped heat and trapped humidity, layered over stagnating water. The heron croaked weakly. Eldrin answered with a low grunting call. It wasn't communication, just acknowledgement of shared unease. A low mechanical hum echoed from the research platform. The scientists were active again. Eldrin made his way closer, stepping through reeds that snapped dry against his legs. As he approached, he heard their voices, tense, urgent. Temperature differential never formed last night. Nothing cooled at the surface. Fog formation potential was high, but the inversion layer prevented lift. Humidity stuck at ground level. Vapor pressure way off. This is exactly how wetlands begin to collapse. One of them held a device near the surface, a hygrometer. He read the numbers aloud. The others fell silent. Another tapped on a screen. Evapotranspiration from plants dropped to almost zero. Because the air is saturated right above the ground but cannot move upward. So the plants can't release water. So the ground stays wet but the air dries just above it. The whole system is suffocating. Eldrin watched them, tilting his head. Humans couldn't feel the marsh the way he could, but they were close. They sensed the missing breath too. He moved past them and into one of the narrow channels that normally connected to a hidden deep pool. This was his favourite fishing spot. At dawn, fish would come close to the surface, rising into cooled water where he could catch them with a single strike. But as he stepped into the channel, he realised it was shallow, much too shallow. The mud squelched around his legs, warm and soft in a dangerous way. Shallow water heated quickly and lost oxygen. Fish would flee deeper, but deeper no longer existed here. Without fog, without nightly cooling, the marsh's deeper pools no longer refilled. He strode toward the pool anyway, wings slightly open for balance. When he reached it, dread spiraled through him. The pool was shrinking. Its edges cracked. Water had fallen away, leaving exposed roots and drying algae mats. A few fish huddled in what remained, moving weakly, their scales dull from stress. Eldrin stepped carefully into the water, lowering his beak. He tasted heat. He tasted stagnation. He tasted the beginning of death. A carp thrashed once, then floated sideways. Not enough oxygen. Too much warmth. He backed away, feathers ruffling in discomfort. Above him, a group of swallows circled, but not the way swallows should. Their flight path was sluggish, unstable. They darted low, searching for insects that normally rose with the fog, but the insects remained hidden, clinging to stems, waiting for conditions that wouldn't come. A swallow dove once, twice, missing its prey, then retreated, wings beating with frustration. Even aerial life struggled. The marsh wasn't functioning. Its cycles were collapsing, its rhythms broken. Eldrin turned toward the research platform again. The scientists were lowering a long probe deep into the mud. One of them wiped sweat from her forehead, not from heat, but from humidity trapped at ground level. Ground temperature too warm, she muttered. No nighttime cooling at all. This place needs the fog cycle to survive. If it fails a few more days, we'll see mass die-offs. Plants first, then insects, then amphibians. Birds next. Eldrin's feathers tightened. He didn't understand their words, but he understood the tone, and he had already seen what they feared. He glanced toward the horizon, hoping for the slightest sign. Mist forming, vapour rising, even the faintest curl of fog above the water. Nothing. The air sat heavy and warm. The water lay exposed, too warm to heal overnight. The reeds drooped, the frogs gasped, the fish hid deeper, then deeper still, until no deeper existed. The marsh still held water, still looked alive from afar, but its breath was gone. Eldrin slowly folded his wings and stood in silence. He waited for the fog that defined his world. He waited for the marsh to exhale. He waited for the morning cycle to return. But the water stayed warm, the air stayed trapped, the sky stayed dry, and the marsh, once a place of rising vapour and living mist, could only wither in a dawn that refused to breathe.